On the night of their wedding reception, my daughter's husband leaned close, forced a smile for the cameras, and muttered in my ear, "It must be nice having a career that's nothing more than blisters and dirt."
The word struck harder than any piece of falling lumber ever had. I had heard men curse me, seen rivals spit at me on job sites, felt rain soak me to the bone while I bent steel until my fingers went numb, but never had I been laughed at for the very thing that gave my family a roof, a table, and bread to eat. I didn't flinch, though. A man who has bent his back for decades doesn't tremble at a boy's smirk. Instead, I let him shake my hand, and in silence I held his gaze long enough for him to feel the weight of what he mocked. He had soft hands, the kind that never carried lumber up 3 flights of stairs, never tightened a wrench until the veins in the wrist threatened to burst, never pressed against frozen metal in the dead of winter. His were hands that only knew how to press buttons, swipe screens, sign checks he hadn't earned. He called my calluses weakness, but I knew better. They were proof of battles fought without applause, of nights I staggered home, but never missed a day's work, of sacrifices that built the very future he thought he owned now. My daughter, radiant in her dress, stood across the room. She didn't hear the words, or perhaps she did and pretended not to. That silence was worse than the insult itself. In her eyes I saw pride for her new husband, not shame at his cruelty. A knot formed in my chest. Was this the cost of being a man who worked with his body? That even your own child would learn to look past the worth of your hands, because the world taught her to worship polish over grit. I walked outside for air. The night was cold, the wind cutting across my knuckles. I rubbed my palms together, tracing the rough ridges of skin. Each scar was a story. The ladder that slipped when I was 19, the nail that pierced through when I was 25, the machine that almost crushed me at 40. Each mark was not just an injury, it was a record of staying, of not quitting, of giving my family something no diploma or desk job could ever replace: security. He thought his laughter would shrink me, but instead it reminded me of a truth I carried like armor. Those who mock work have never known hunger, never feared the knock of debt collectors, never wondered if the paycheck would stretch to keep the lights on. My hands had done more than build walls and pour concrete. They had kept my children warm. They had bought her wedding dress. They had given her the life she now shared with the very man who dared to ridicule them. What I didn't know that night, what none of us could have guessed, was that one day his polished shoes would walk through the gates of the very company my hands helped raise from the ground. And when he did, those same calluses he mocked would rise from memory to haunt him, to judge him, and to remind him that sweat leaves a legacy arrogance cannot erase. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life, when your hard work or sacrifices were mocked? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That way you're helping us grow this channel and bring even more stories to life. And now, let's continue. At the next family dinner, the wound he had opened at the wedding was ripped wider. The table was full. My daughter setting down dishes she had prepared, her husband sitting tall, always needing the spotlight, always craving the last word. The room carried that quiet warmth of family, but beneath it was a sharp edge I could feel before he even opened his mouth. And then it came. He laughed, shaking his head, fork clinking against his plate, and said it as if it were the simplest truth in the world. A hammer and nails, that's your whole career, isn't it? The sound of his voice seemed to cut through everything. The clinking of glasses stopped for me. The laughter around the table dimmed. My daughter's eyes flickered to mine for a second, then slid away, as if ashamed to even defend me. That, more than his words, pierced me deeper than any blade. She had grown up watching me leave before dawn, watching me return with aching shoulders, bringing home bread, bills paid, shoes on her feet. And yet here she was, silent in the shadow of his arrogance, as though part of her believed what he said, that her father's life was nothing more than splinters and sweat.
I smiled then. Not out of humor, not because I agreed, but because sometimes a man learns to let silence carry the weight of truth. Inside, though, it wasn't silence. It was a storm. Every muscle in me tensed, not with anger, but with that old familiar ache of knowing that dignity rarely speaks loudly. He saw only wood and nails. He didn't see the nights the roof would have caved in had I not been there. He didn't see the machines that would have stopped running had I not bent down on my knees to fix them with these same scarred hands. He didn't see the long winters when I worked overtime so the heat in our home would not shut off. He saw only the surface. And my daughter, God help me, chose not to correct him. As I chewed my food, I felt each bite turn to ash. My thoughts wandered back, uninvited, to those younger years. I remembered being 17, standing on scaffolding while snow whipped across my face, my hands raw and shaking but never letting go of the steel beam I was fastening. I remembered 30, when my youngest was sick, and I sold the only thing of value I had left, my old guitar, to buy her medicine. I remembered 40, when my wife whispered late at night that she didn't know how much longer we could keep going, and I promised her, with all the certainty I could muster, that I would make sure we never fell apart. My hammer and nails were not tools of poverty. They were weapons against despair. They were proof I had kept my word. He couldn't have understood. To him, work was something beneath him, something to be mocked while wine was poured and plates were passed. To me, work was everything. It was the difference between dignity and begging, between holding your head high and bowing it in shame. And that night, when his laughter died down and my daughter looked everywhere except at me, I knew the gap between my world and theirs was no longer just a difference in generation. It was a chasm, one that could not be crossed with explanations. I kept my smile, though it was bitter. Not because his insult had power, but because I understood something he did not. Men like him eventually learn that life always collects its debts. And when that day came, it would not be money or charm that saved him. It would be the very skills he mocked, the very labor he sneered at. My silence at that table was not surrender. It was the patience of a man who has seen storms roll in, who knows the ground always shifts. I left that dinner with my chest heavy, but my back straight. My daughter had looked away, yes. But one day, she too would have to look back, when the truth came knocking. And truth has a way of knocking loudest at the doors of those who once laughed the hardest. That evening, after the laughter had settled and the plates were cleared, a different kind of trial began. The kind without judges, without gavels, without defense. It was the court of family, where silence weighs heavier than any verdict spoken aloud. My daughter had not defended me. She had not raised her voice against the words that cut me open. Instead, she bowed her head and let the insult linger in the air, like smoke that choked the room. And that silence, that unwillingness to stand, was louder than anything her husband had said. I sat there, feeling the weight of every year that had gone into building her life. I thought of the birthdays where I worked double shifts so her cake would be bigger, of the shoes I mended late at night when money ran thin, of the way I carried her on my shoulders so she could see fireworks above the crowd. All of that, sweat turned into love, labor turned into security, seemed to vanish with her downcast eyes. She wasn't proud of the man who had held the line. She was embarrassed. And in that moment I realized something I had been too blind to admit. The respect I had thought unshakable was already gone. The room became suffocating. Forks scraped against plates. Someone tried to tell a joke. The clock ticked on the wall. Life went forward, as though nothing had happened. But I sat there in the center of it all, and it felt like the world had shifted. I wasn't a father to be honored anymore. I was an old man at the table, tolerated, smiled at when convenient, dismissed when uncomfortable. They had put me on trial without words, and the verdict was already written in the way she refused to meet my gaze. I remembered the first time she held my hand as a child, her tiny fingers wrapping around my calloused thumb, her eyes shining with the kind of trust only children have. Back then, she didn't see the scars, the dirt under the nails, the roughness of my grip. She saw safety, she saw strength, and now, grown, standing beside a man who measured worth by softness and polish, she chose not to see me at all. The betrayal was not in his words, it was in her silence. That night, as I drove home, the headlights stretching the road ahead, I felt a hollowness settle in my chest. Not anger, not even shame, just the deep, steady ache of a man who realizes the dignity he built with his bare hands had no place in his own daughter's house. Respect had died quietly, without a word, buried under laughter and silence alike. And though I told myself not to let it matter, the truth was clear. Something had broken. Something I had thought eternal. Still, even in that moment of quiet judgment, I held on to one conviction. Life has a way of circling back, of testing the strength of every word spoken, every silence held. One day, I knew she would see. One day, the truth would stand taller than mockery. But that night, in that house, I was the only one who still believed in the worth of my labor. And nothing cuts deeper than being a stranger in the very family your hands built. He never tried to hide what he thought of me. In fact, he seemed to wear it proudly, as if mocking the life I had lived somehow lifted his own stature. Around the family table, he always spoke of big projects and real business, letting the words roll off his tongue like they carried the weight of destiny. He talked about investments, about meetings with important people, about ventures that, according to him, would change everything. His voice filled the room, and my daughter leaned closer, eager to believe in the world he painted. But behind every polished phrase, I could hear the hollow echo of a man with no foundation. I had seen men like him before, countless times, on construction sites, in offices, in the break rooms of factories. Men who believed their clever talk was worth more than the sweat dripping down the back of a laborer. They strutted, convinced that standing in the shade of other people's work made them kings. And for a while, perhaps it did. But I knew the truth. Storms strip paint, floods wash away facades, and time eventually exposes what is hollow. Beneath all his promises, I saw nothing but borrowed pride and second-hand ambition. He lived on money that was never his, on networks he didn't build, on a family name that gave him entry into rooms where he hadn't earned a seat. Each time he spoke, I watched the way my daughter looked at him. Her eyes lit up with hope, the way she once looked at me when I carried her on my shoulders and told her the stars belonged to her. Now, that light wasn't for me, it was for him, for his smooth assurances of a future carved without sweat or sacrifice. And though I kept my silence, a stone lodged deeper in my chest with every word he spoke. I knew what it meant. She had been convinced that his empty brilliance was worth more than the quiet dignity of work that had kept her safe her whole life. I could not despise him entirely. No, what I felt was something sharper, something heavier. Pity mixed with fury, because I knew the path he walked, the one that depended on charm instead of endurance, was a path that ended in collapse. A man can ride the strength of others only so long before the ground gives way beneath him, and when it did, he would have nothing, no skill, no callus, no strength to fall back on, only words, brittle as glass, shattering at the first true test. He boasted one evening about a deal he almost closed, waving his hands as though they had accomplished something greater than laying brick or bending steel. I looked at those hands, smooth, untested, and felt the sting of irony.
They had never bled for anything, never carried the weight of survival. They were hands that took, that pointed, that gestured, but never built. And though no one else saw it, I did. That was the hollowness I couldn't ignore. A man who had everything to say, but nothing to stand on. As he laughed, as he poured wine into his glass with the confidence of someone who thought the world was his to command, I sat back and let my silence shield me. Let him think he was above me. Let him think the world belonged to men like him, because deep inside I knew life has a way of stripping arrogance bare. The day would come when he would walk into a place where his words meant nothing, where his polished shoes slipped on the floor built by men like me. And when that day came, it wouldn't be me who reminded him of the truth. The world itself would. When I thought of the life he dismissed so easily, my mind always returned to the company I had given my years to. To him it was nothing. Just another factory in an endless line of places he would never set foot in unless he had to. But to me it was sacred ground. That building, with its clang of steel and hum of machines, was more than walls and equipment. It was a living organism. A place that breathed because men like me poured our strength into it. Every brick I carried, every beam I steadied, every machine I tuned at midnight while the city slept. It was all part of a body that gave life to countless families. I remembered the first day I walked through its gates. Younger, poorer, but determined. The smell of oil, the sting of metal dust in my lungs, the vibration of machines under my boots. It was hard, merciless work, the kind that didn't care who you were or what dreams you carried. It demanded respect, and I gave it mine. I bled there, I aged there, but I also built a piece of myself into those walls. For him, it would always be dirty labor, something beneath the dignity of a man who fancied himself born for more. But when I closed my eyes, I could see the faces of men standing shoulder to shoulder with me. Men who carried their children on their backs and their futures in their hands. They weren't nameless. They were brothers. It wasn't glory we were after. None of us expected parades or statues. We wanted something far simpler, that our families could eat, that our children could study, that the lights would stay on at night. And through our sweat, it happened. The company grew. People built homes, bought cars, sent kids to universities. Generations were lifted up on the strength of our hands. I would walk through the town and see lights shining from windows that would have been dark if not for the factory. And I carried a pride deeper than any title or salary could offer. For me, the factory was never just work. It was a promise I had kept. I had told my wife in the earliest years, when money was tight and nights were long, that I would give us a life where our children would not know hunger, where our family would not break under the weight of despair. The factory was the proof. It was the altar where my years of sacrifice were laid down, brick by brick, hour by hour. And though I had walked away from it, retired and weary, I knew that pieces of me were still welded into its beams. He would never understand that. To him, labor was shame. Sweat was failure. He saw the dirt on my boots and thought it meant I had not climbed high enough. But what he never realized was that I had climbed as high as a man could climb, because I had carried others with me. While he measured success by the softness of his hands, I measured mine by the families that stood firm because of the work we did. And one day, whether he wanted it or not, his footsteps would cross that same ground. He would walk through those gates, thinking he was above it all. And then he would learn what I already knew, that true worth is not measured in boardrooms or boasts, but in the clang of a hammer, in the hum of machines, in the hands of men who quietly build a world others take for granted. It was an ordinary evening when the words fell from her lips, but they struck me harder than any blow I'd ever taken.
My daughter sat across from me, smiling as if she were bringing me good news, her voice light, almost playful. "He's applied for a job at your old company." For a moment I couldn't even breathe. My heart gave a sharp twist, not from pride, not from the satisfaction a father might feel when his child or her husband tried to walk the same road he once walked, but from the bitter taste of irony that burned all the way down. The same man who mocked my calluses, who laughed at the hammer and nails that built his wife's life, was now knocking at the very gates where my blood still lived in the concrete. I didn't answer her right away. My mind wandered back to those gates, to the smell of hot iron rising from the floors, to the echo of boots on steel stairways, to the faces of men long gone who once sweated beside me. I thought of how much of myself I had left there, my strength, my years, my very body, carved into that factory like initials carved into stone. And now, this man, who had never lifted more than a wineglass, would walk into that place believing it owed him a future. He was not seeking a job, he was seeking validation, proof that he could exist in the world without the shield of borrowed money and easy words. But the cruelest part was that he would be walking straight into a legacy he had already spat on. My daughter's eyes were bright with expectation, as though she believed this news would stitch something between us, as though her husband's application could somehow be a bridge over the silence and disappointment that had grown between father and child. She didn't understand. For her, it was all possibility, a paycheck, a steady place, a mark of respectability. For me, it was a wound torn open again. I could not tell her what I truly felt, that his presence there would not honor my years but desecrate them, that his footsteps echoing down those corridors would not be a continuation of my life but a mockery of it. I went to bed that night, restless. The thought haunted me. I imagined him standing before the men who still remembered me, shaking their hands with that smug confidence, speaking about ambition and vision, as if those words could replace decades of work. I pictured him in the break room pretending to belong, talking of projects, as though the men who lifted steel with broken backs were simple-minded laborers waiting for a leader like him. The factory was not a stage for arrogance. It was a crucible, a place where character was revealed, not manufactured. And I knew sooner or later it would strip him bare. But what burned most wasn't the thought of his failure. It was my daughter's pride in him. That she could smile as she told me, believing it would make me proud, not realizing it made me feel like a stranger in my own story. She could not see the irony. She could not see the insult. She only saw opportunity. And in her innocence, or was it blindness, she placed the dagger deeper into my chest without knowing it. I turned to the wall that night, staring into the dark. I wasn't praying for his downfall. No. Life would teach him its lessons without my help. What I prayed for was strength, not to harden my heart, but to endure the moment when she would come back to me, eyes clouded, voice trembling, finally understanding who I had been all along. Because when the factory tested him, as I knew it would, she would see the truth with her own eyes. And the truth was sharper than any insult, harsher than any silence. The truth was that the man she had married had built nothing, and the man she had doubted had built everything she stood upon. The news of his interview reached me not from my daughter's lips this time, but from the mouths of men who had once stood beside me in the roar of machines and the glare of welding sparks. They spoke with the kind of half-amused disbelief that only hardened workers carry when life serves irony too rich to ignore. He came in confident, one of them told me, like the world already owed him the job, sat down in the office, crossed his legs, spoke as though he were the one granting us the privilege of his presence. I could almost see it, his smooth posture, his voice polished, his hands gesturing like a man rehearsing for an audience that never arrived. He thought the factory would bend to his charm the way people at family dinners bent to his talk. But I knew better. Those walls never bent for anyone. I could picture the room where he sat, plain, with its metal chairs and old clock that ticked louder than any speech. The air there carried the weight of decades, of men judged not by resumes or promises, but by what they had lifted, fixed, and endured. That office had smelled of oil and ink when I sat there for my first interview all those years ago. Sweat soaking my shirt, my hands rough and bleeding, but my voice steady as I said I would do whatever work they asked. And I had, for years without complaint. Those walls still remembered. They remembered the sound of my boots, the hours I gave, the loyalty I carried. They did not bow to arrogance then, and they would not now. He, of course, came armed with words. He spoke of projects, of strategies, of long-term visions. He had memorized the language of men who build nothing but convince others they will. To my colleagues, it was noise. They had seen men like him come and go, wearing suits too clean for the floors, believing that talk alone could keep machines running. Yet, the machines do not answer to promises. They answer to hands, steady, scarred, patient hands that know how to twist a wrench until the stubborn bolt gives way, that know how to feel when metal is right or wrong, that can hear when the hum of a motor signals life or death. His voice carried none of that. The men told me he looked surprised when they asked him real questions, not about visions or leadership, but about grit, about whether he had ever handled a tool, whether he had stood through a night shift, whether he could last when the winter winds cut through broken windows and still the machines had to run. His answers stumbled. He tried to cover the gaps with confidence, but confidence is paper thin, fragile, and useless against fire. The room smelled of truth, and truth has no patience for arrogance. I walked alone later that evening, thinking about it, and I could not stop the bitter smile tugging at my lips. Not joy, never joy, but something closer to the grim satisfaction of seeing the world do what I no longer needed to. The company had been my judge once, and I had proved myself day after day until it gave me a name among its people. Now it stood as his judge, and words would not be enough. The walls had listened, yes, but they had not believed. They would wait, as they always did, to see what his hands could carry, what his back could bear, what his pride could survive. And in that waiting, I knew he would meet the truth he had spent years mocking. He would learn that work is not a stage to be conquered. It is a weight to be carried. And when that weight pressed down, when the iron smell filled his lungs and the noise rang in his ears, the factory would ask the only question that mattered. Not who are you, but what can you endure? When he walked into that place with his polished shoes and proud posture, he carried more than his own name on his shoulders. He carried mine. The men who had sweated beside me, who had bled with me under the roar of the machines, saw him and whispered among themselves. "That's Paul's son-in-law, isn't it? Paul, the one who hauled cement when no one else would, who was there before dawn, who left after dark, who carried the floor when everyone else thought it would give way." My name was not on the walls, but it lived in their voices. It lived in their memory. And when they looked at him, they saw not a new worker, but the shadow of a man they remembered with respect. That echo was too heavy for him to bear. I knew the sound of that echo. I had lived long enough to understand that reputation is not built in words, but in years, in the quiet sacrifice no one claps for, in the sweat no one photographs. They remembered me not because I demanded it, but because I stayed. Through winters so cold the bolts froze to the steel, through summers when sweat poured like rain, through nights when machines broke down and no one else had the strength to rise from their chairs, I rose. And for that, they carried my name like a kind of unspoken oath. Paul worked, Paul endured, Paul built. Now, That echo pressed against the ears of the man who had mocked me, and in its weight, his arrogance began to crack. He smiled, of course. He always smiled, always carried himself with the assurance of a man who had never been tested. He spoke with his smooth voice, talking of plans, of futures, of ambitions. But the men didn't hear him. They heard me. They heard the footsteps of the man who had walked their same path, who had bent his back beside them, who had never claimed to be better but proved himself by showing up again and again, and the comparison was merciless. His words floated in the air like smoke. My name was the foundation beneath their feet. I could imagine their laughter later, quiet but sharp, the kind men share when truth is obvious, but politeness keeps them silent in the moment. This is the man who mocked Paul. This is the one who thought he was above labor. They had no need to say more. His presence among them was already a humiliation, because every look reminded him that he had once ridiculed the very labor that defined me, and now he came begging to be part of it. At home, I felt the echo too. Not as pride, not as revenge, but as something deeper, something sorrowful. Because while those men remembered me with respect, my own daughter had chosen silence. Among strangers, my name was a banner. In my own bloodline, it was an embarrassment. That truth stung worse than any insult, but I held on to it quietly, because I knew time had a way of forcing recognition. One day, even she would hear that echo and not be able to silence it anymore. The factory did not forget me. The men did not forget me. The work did not forget me. And in the shadow of that memory, her husband was stripped bare. His charm meant nothing in the presence of those who remembered endurance. His pride wilted in the face of those who had seen real sacrifice. He came with ambition, but all they saw was the frail reflection of a man who thought himself superior to the very ground he now begged to stand upon. That is the cruelty of echoes. They cannot be silenced. They linger in the air long after the voice itself is gone. And in that factory, my name lived on, a quiet reminder that some legacies are carved so deep into the bones of a place that no mockery can erase them. They didn't hand him a throne, they didn't give him a desk or a title or an audience. They gave him a place at the machine, the same as they gave every man who ever set foot in that factory. No ceremony, no special treatment, no chance to hide behind clever phrases, just a task so simple it was almost cruel in its honesty. Take the wrench, tighten the bolts, make the line move. And there, stripped of pretense, he met a truth he had never known. Metal doesn't bend to arrogance, it doesn't care about charm, it will not yield to a smile. The wrench sat in his hand heavier than he expected. His fingers curled around it awkwardly, soft palms unprepared for the bite of steel. For the first time in his life, his body was called upon to prove something, not his tongue. He looked at the bolt, simple and stubborn, and began to turn. But the metal resisted. His grip slipped. His wrist trembled. Sweat broke on his brow far too soon. His breath quickened, and the men who watched out of the corners of their eyes did not laugh. Not yet. They knew the machine was the fairest judge of all. It humbled the proud and honored the steady. And in that moment, they waited to see which one he would be. I had stood at that very line decades before, young and uncertain, but determined. I remembered how the wrench had nearly torn the skin from my palm the first time, how the noise rattled my bones, how I thought I would never last the week. But I stayed. I stayed until my hands hardened, until my arms obeyed, until the machine and I moved as one rhythm. That was how respect was born, not in a single day, but in the repetition of endurance. And as I thought of him now, I knew he did not carry the patience to endure. He had lived a life cushioned by softness. His pride had been built on borrowed comfort. And now the factory was peeling it away, layer by layer. The bolt still would not yield. He tried again, his face tightening, his breath escaping in sharp bursts. The men nearby kept their silence, but I can imagine what passed between them in a glance. This one will not last. And though no one spoke it aloud, the air carried the weight of judgment. Because in a place where everyone has bled, where every man has left pieces of himself on the floor, failure is not in slipping once. It is in showing that you cannot rise again. And he, with his polished shoes and manicured nails, was already faltering. By the end of that shift, his shirt clung to his back, his arms shook from the effort, and his pride had been beaten into silence. He left the machine with nothing accomplished, nothing to boast of. The wrench lay where he dropped it, and the bolt remained only half turned, mocking him without a word. He had discovered a truth he never wanted to face. Words cannot fasten steel. Promises cannot move iron. The world he had ridiculed was merciless, and it demanded everything he did not have. And somewhere in the shadows of that factory, though I was not there in body, my presence lived on. The men remembered, the walls remembered, the machines remembered. They remembered the man who once stood where he stood now, and did not break. And beside that memory, his effort was nothing more than noise swallowed by the roar of labor. He left the factory floor not as the man who entered that morning. The shine of his shoes had dulled, his collar clung to his neck with sweat, and his once proud stride faltered beneath the weight of a labor he had never known. His shirt, once crisp and pressed, bore the stains of oil and dust, the dark marks that every worker wears as a badge, but on him they did not look like honor, they looked like defeat. He had walked in with a chest full of pride and a voice full of certainty. He walked out with his shoulders slumped, the first crack in his armor of arrogance carved deep and visible. I could picture it without being there. The factory has a way of bending men down to their true size. It had straightened me once, tested me until I learned to stand tall under its weight. But for him, the weight was too much. His confidence, once sharp enough to cut through dinner conversations, now hung heavy, dulled by the simple truth of steel and sweat. The men who watched him leave didn't need to speak. They had seen it before. Newcomers who arrived with bravado, only to discover that the machines do not bow, that the work does not yield, that dignity is not granted by title but by endurance. He was one more name on that long list of pretenders, and they let him walk out with silence as his only companion. I imagined the look in his eyes as he reached the exit. Not the gleam of a conqueror, but the emptiness of someone who realized too late that the world does not bend to will alone. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he saw himself without the mask of wealth, without the shield of charm, just a man, soft, untested, and suddenly small in a world that asked more of him than he could give. That realization doesn't come like a thunderclap. It seeps in slowly, with every bead of sweat, every failed attempt, every bolt that refuses to turn. And by the time he stepped outside, it was no longer arrogance that clung to him. It was shame. The sun was setting when he left the yard, its light catching on the grime of his shirt, turning it into a mirror of who he truly was in that moment. A man humbled, a man bruised, not in body, but in spirit. And though I wasn't there, I knew that walk all too well. I had seen others take it, the first walk of defeat, when the weight of the work reveals the gap between who you think you are and who you truly are. But unlike them, unlike me, he lacked the one thing that could turn defeat into strength, the will to return, to keep standing until the factory itself granted you a place among its own. He had entered believing himself superior, certain that he would rise above the men who bore the scars of labor. He left with the undeniable truth pressed into his skin. The ground he mocked had bent him low, and the world he disdained had refused him entry. Where I had once stood proud in that same place, his back was bent, his spirit dimmed. And though he would try to hide it behind words later, though he would laugh at dinners and boast of other things, the men had seen, the walls had seen, the machines had seen, and the factory does not forget.
That day marked his first defeat, not the last, but the first taste of what it meant to be measured by something greater than charm, greater than words. He had stepped into my world, and my world had reminded him, without anger, without malice, that true worth is forged in endurance, not in empty pride. And already the iron had rejected him. They didn't mock him openly. That was not the way of men who had learned respect the hard way. Their laughter came quietly, in corners of the workshop, carried in the exchange of glances, in the curl of a smile at the edge of a mouth when his name was mentioned. It wasn't cruel laughter, not the kind meant to tear a man down, but the kind that rises when the truth becomes too obvious to ignore. "He's just like the rest of them," they murmured, and in those words was a justice he couldn't escape. But even that was a mercy, for the truth was worse. He wasn't just like the rest. He was weaker. I knew that kind of judgment well. The factory floor has always been its own kind of jury, and every man who steps onto it stands trial. Not by bosses in offices, not by supervisors with clipboards, but by the men who sweat beside you, who know by instinct whether you will last or whether you will fold. And once that verdict is passed, it clings to you like smoke. It follows you into every break room, every hallway, every shift. For him, the verdict had been sealed in whispers. "This one does not belong." I pictured him moving among them, trying to stand tall again, forcing a grin, as though the dirt on his shirt and the ache in his arms had been some accident of circumstance. But the eyes of working men are sharp. They can see when strength is false, when confidence is patched over weakness. He may have tried to laugh along with them, may have tried to act as though nothing had broken, but the silence that followed him told another story. He had already been measured, already been found wanting, and no words could undo that. What must it have been like for him, I wondered, to hear his own name carried in the breath of laughter, to feel the weight of men's eyes on him, not with admiration, but with quiet dismissal. For a man who had lived his life in borrowed pride, it must have felt unbearable. Because in that place, where men built their dignity day by day through work no one outside those walls ever truly saw, he had revealed himself to be hollow. And hollowness echoes. It cannot be hidden. I thought of the many times I, too, had been whispered about. But the whispers that carried my name were not the same. They spoke of the man who came first, who stayed late, who held his ground when the work was hardest. My name had lived there long after I was gone, because I had paid its price. His name, already, was spoken with a smile that cut sharper than open ridicule. Not hated, not feared, not respected, just dismissed. And that dismissal is the heaviest sentence of all. In life, the cruelest kind of defeat is not when the world rises against you, but when it quietly refuses to take you seriously. That was his fate now. His arrogance had collapsed into a shadow of itself, and the men who had once given him the courtesy of silence now gave him something worse, indifference. They saw him, laughed softly, then forgot him. And in a place where memory is everything, where even the smallest acts of endurance are remembered for decades, to be forgotten is the deepest shame of all. He wanted to be greater than me, to prove he was the better man, the more successful son-in-law, the one who had risen above labor. But already he had sunk below it. Where I had left the factory with my name still alive in its walls, he walked its floors with nothing but pity in the eyes behind him. And pity, I knew, was a weight he would never carry with grace. When he returned home that evening, the man who had once strutted into every room with laughter ready on his tongue entered like a shadow of himself. His shoes dragged against the floor instead of striking with confidence. His shoulders slumped under an invisible weight that had nothing to do with labor,
and everything to do with pride. And when his eyes met mine, only for a fleeting second, they fell to the ground almost immediately, as if the force of my gaze was heavier than any bolt he had failed to turn. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't wear that smug smile. He didn't throw his sharp little comments across the table like daggers. He sat quietly, and in that quietness, I saw not respect, but defeat. It wasn't the silence of a man who had learned. It wasn't humility, not yet. It was the silence of someone cornered by the truth and unable to explain it away. The truth had beaten him down in a language he couldn't argue with. The machines had spoken to him more honestly than any words I could have offered. They had shown him who he was without disguise, and he had seen himself reflected in the sweat, in the stubborn bolts, in the strength he didn't have. That reflection was unbearable, and now he wore it across his face like ash. My daughter tried to fill the space with words, fussing about the meal, asking him how his day had gone. He mumbled something, half-hearted, and didn't meet her eyes either. She laughed nervously, as though she could sweep away the heaviness in the room with the sound of her voice. But it lingered, unmovable. He sat there, eating in silence, his fork scraping against the plate in awkward rhythm. Every sound in that room was louder than usual. The ticking of the clock, the clink of glasses, the faint hum of the refrigerator. And above it all, the silence between us swelled until it filled every corner. I watched him carefully, not out of cruelty, not because I wanted to savor his fall, but because I understood this was the moment where a man either breaks or begins to rise. His silence could have been the soil of growth, a space where he might finally recognize the value of what he had mocked. But what I saw in his lowered eyes told me otherwise. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't a new respect forming. It was shame, bitter and heavy, twisting inside him with resentment. Not admiration for the work, not gratitude for those who carried it, but the gnawing awareness that he had been measured and found less. That night, when he excused himself early and walked down the hall with heavy steps, I remained at the table, my hands resting on the wood scarred with years of family meals. I looked at my daughter, and for the first time she seemed unsure, her smile forced, her eyes troubled. Perhaps she had seen it too, the shadow of defeat that clung to him, the absence of the man she thought she had married. And perhaps she began to wonder if the strength she once overlooked in me was the very thing missing in him. That night, when he excused himself early and walked down the hall with heavy steps, I remained at the table, my hands resting on the wood scarred with years of family meals. I looked at my daughter, and for the first time she seemed unsure, her smile forced, her eyes troubled. Perhaps she had seen it too, the shadow of defeat that clung to him, the absence of the man she thought she had married. And perhaps she began to wonder if the strength she once overlooked in me was the very thing missing in him. He hadn't mocked me this time. He hadn't dared. But the silence he carried was louder than any insult. And I knew, as surely as I knew the weight of a hammer in my hand, that this was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a man losing the battle within himself. That evening, long after the dishes had been cleared and the silence in the house had grown thick, my daughter finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though the words themselves were heavy to carry. "Dad, I didn't know it was that hard." It was not a declaration, not even an apology. It was a fracture in the wall she had built between us, the first crack through which truth slipped. And in that crack, I heard not only surprise, but something deeper, an admission that she had always known, deep down, and chosen not to see. Her words struck me harder than her husband's insults ever had. Because an insult from a stranger wounds the pride, but silence from your own child wounds the soul. She had grown up watching me come home with dirt on my boots, hands raw, eyes weary, but still lit with the quiet fire of a man who knows he has provided. She had seen me leave before dawn, return after dark, carrying not just tools, but the burden of every responsibility that made her life possible. And yet she had let herself believe the story her husband told, that my work was small, that my hands were unworthy. Now, sitting at that table with the echo of her husband's failure still in the air, she could no longer deny what her eyes had seen, and her heart had known all along. I didn't answer her right away. I simply looked at her, and in that silence I let her words rest heavy between us. She shifted in her chair, her hands folding together nervously, her gaze dropping the way his had earlier. She wasn't just admitting ignorance, she was admitting betrayal, and that betrayal was not born in cruelty, but in convenience. It was easier for her to believe in the glitter of her husband's promises than to honor the quiet truth of her father's labor. But reality has a way of tearing through illusions, and she had heard it that night in the faltering tone of the man she chose to stand beside. Her voice trembled again, softer this time. I thought it was just work. Just work. Two words that carried generations of misunderstanding. To her, it had been invisible. The meals, the clothes, the warm house, the laughter at Christmas, all of it resting on the back of labor she never had to see closely enough to understand. But sitting there, watching her husband return, broken by the very labor she once dismissed, she realized that just work was the thread that had held her whole life together. In that moment, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet ache. Because I had never labored for recognition. I had never asked for applause or acknowledgement. All I wanted was for my children to know they were safe, that they had more than I had growing up, that they could chase dreams without the shadow of hunger or despair. Her words were proof that she finally saw it. But they were also proof that it had taken her too long. I reached for my glass and took a slow sip, letting the moment stretch. I could feel her eyes on me, searching for some answer, some comfort, some absolution. But I gave her none. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because this was a truth she needed to carry herself. Respect is not something you grant too late without cost. And though her voice carried a crack of realization, it also carried the weight of years where she had chosen not to speak, not to defend, not to honor. I looked at her, finally, and our eyes met. She didn't look away this time, and in her gaze I saw something fragile being born. Respect, yes, but also regret. The kind that lingers, the kind that reshapes how you remember your own life. That night, in her small, trembling words, I heard not just her voice, but the sound of a bridge being rebuilt, plank by plank, across a distance she had once allowed to grow. After that week, his voice changed. The man who once filled every room with boasts about real business and big projects fell strangely quiet whenever the subject of work came near. He no longer used the phrase dirty labor. He no longer smirked when talk of the factory surfaced at the table. Instead, his eyes shifted, his fork scraped against the plate, his throat cleared as though words were there but could not find the courage to come out. He had learned something, not through lectures, not through my silence, but through the merciless language of labor itself, and that lesson clung to him like a shadow he could not shake. He avoided details when my daughter asked how his days were going. He spoke vaguely, circling around the truth because the truth carried a weight too sharp to admit aloud. He had seen the difference between men who merely show up and men who belong. He had stood beside workers who didn't need to brag, whose scars and patience were their introduction, and in their presence his confidence collapsed. The world he thought beneath him had revealed itself to be stronger, tougher, and more honorable than anything he had ever claimed to represent. And though he would never say it, I knew. The echo of that realization would follow him for the rest of his life. In that space, I remained still. I did not press him. I did not gloat. I let the silence do its work, because silence is a sharper teacher than words. I knew the factory had already done what I never could. It had stripped away his pride and shown him the naked truth. He no longer saw hammers and nails as small things. He saw them as pillars he could never lift, And though he would spend the rest of his life avoiding those words, avoiding that subject, I knew that every time his eyes fell on my hands, he would remember the weight of his own weakness. I thought often of my hands then, scarred and stiff with age. The same hands he mocked. They had carried more than wood, more than steel. They had carried the dignity of a family through winters and debts, through hunger and fear. They had turned hammers and wrenches, yes, but they had also held babies, written checks to keep the lights on, and lifted my wife when she was too tired to stand on her own. My hands were not just tools, they were a record of a life spent keeping promises. And in his silence, in his refusal now to speak of the factory, I saw that he had finally glimpsed that truth. He knew he had mocked not just my labor, but the very foundation of what makes a man. And yet I felt no triumph, only a kind of quiet grief, because recognition that comes too late carries no joy. He had been broken, yes, but not remade. His silence was not the humility of someone who had learned to respect what he once mocked. It was the bitterness of someone who had been exposed and could not hide anymore. He had seen the measure of real strength, and it had revealed how little of it he carried. In that space I remained still. I did not press him. I did not gloat. I let the silence do its work, because silence is a sharper teacher than words. I knew the factory had already done what I never could. It had stripped away his pride and shown him the naked truth. He no longer saw hammers and nails as small things. He saw them as pillars he could never lift. And though he would spend the rest of his life avoiding those words, avoiding that subject, I knew that every time his eyes fell on my hands, he would remember the weight of his own weakness. That was the fall of his pride. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable. He had mocked what he could not match, and in the end, the very thing he laughed at became the mirror that showed him who he really was. And that reflection would never leave him. I sat on the porch as the evening sun dipped low, painting the horizon in fire and gold. The wooden boards creaked under my weight, the same boards I had nailed in place years ago with my own hands, hands that no longer bent steel or lifted beams, but still carried the memory of every burden they had borne. I breathed in the quiet air, the smell of cut grass, the faint hum of cicadas, and for the first time in years, I felt no anger in my chest, not even pride, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when life itself delivers justice without you lifting a finger. So I sat on the porch, watching the sun lower itself into the horizon, its light spilling across the fields I had mowed, across the house I had built, across the boards beneath my feet. My daughter's silence beside me was no longer the silence of avoidance, but the silence of respect, the kind too deep for words. And in that moment, I understood what true victory felt like. It was not triumph, not applause, not the downfall of another. It was the quiet assurance that what you built with your own hands could never be erased by mockery. She came to sit beside me sometimes, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap, searching for words she couldn't quite form. And I never demanded them. I didn't need them. Respect spoken too late is still respect, and it lives best in the silence of a changed gaze. Her eyes told me enough. They told me she no longer measured me by calluses or by the simplicity of my tools, but by the endurance that had carried her safely to this very life she now lived. For the first time in many years, I felt her look at me not as the man who embarrassed her with his worn hands, but as the man who had given her everything those hands could build. He thought calluses were weakness. He thought labor was low, but he was wrong. My hands, scarred and tired as they were, had carried honor, and honor, once earned, outlives us all. Justice, I realized, is not the roar of revenge. It is the quiet balance of the world setting itself right. He had thought my life was small, that my hammer and nails were signs of weakness, But he had walked into my world, and it had shown him otherwise. The strength he dismissed was the strength he lacked. The dignity he mocked was the dignity he would never hold. And in that knowledge, he was humbled, not by me, but by the very ground he had scorned.
So I sat on the porch, watching the sun lower itself into the horizon, its light spilling across the fields I had mowed, across the house I had built, across the boards beneath my feet. My daughter's silence beside me was no longer the silence of avoidance, but the silence of respect, the kind too deep for words. And in that moment I understood what true victory felt like. It was not triumph, not applause, not the downfall of another. It was the quiet assurance that what you built with your own hands could never be erased by mockery. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile with pride. I simply breathed, steady and calm, as the sky turned from gold to red to indigo. For in the end, justice had spoken in the only voice that mattered, not mine, not his, but the voice of truth itself. And truth, once it rises, stands taller than any insult, shines brighter than any arrogance, and lasts longer than any man's pride.
He thought calluses were weakness. He thought labor was low, but he was wrong. My hands, scarred and tired as they were, had carried honor, and honor, once earned, outlives us all.